How does an orphan with no money, no connections, and no formal education in engineering go on to build the most famous watch brand in the world? The story of Rolex is not just about luxury timepieces or elegant branding. It is a story of resilience, tragedy, innovation, and mystery. Behind the sparkling image of Rolex lies the life of Hans Wilsdorf, a man who faced unimaginable loss, but still managed to create one of the most powerful and secretive companies on earth. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Germany in 1881. He was the son of Anna and Jona Wilsdorf, and his early years were warm and filled with joy. His childhood, however, was cut short by a cruel twist of fate. At just 12 years old, Hans lost both of his parents in the same year. One moment he was a boy surrounded by love. The next he was an orphan with an uncertain future. He was sent to live with his uncles who, without much emotional support, placed him in a boarding school. There, young Hans was forced to find strength in solitude. While grief marked the beginning of this chapter, it did not define it. Hans began to dive into his studies, using schoolwork as a form of escape. He discovered a talent for languages and eventually became fluent in German, English, and French. These skills would later prove critical in his global ambitions. After finishing school, Hans moved to Switzerland to work for a watch export company called Kuno Korten. There he served as a clerk and correspondent. Though his job was largely repetitive, winding hundreds of pocket watches daily, he became deeply fascinated with the art and science of watchmaking. At the time, watches were seen as practical tools, not statements of luxury. Yet Hans developed a vision. He began to dream of creating watches that were not only technically reliable, but also beautifully designed and globally recognized. His next move came in 1903 when he relocated to London and took a sales job with another watch company. This job gave him a clearer understanding of what made some watch brands stand out. He observed the power of marketing, the role of customer trust, and the importance of design. Still in his early 20s, Hans wanted more. He wanted to build something of his own. In 1905, Hans co-founded a company with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. They called it Wilsdorf and Davis. Initially, they focused on importing high-quality Swiss watches to sell in the British market. But Hans was already looking far ahead. He had an unusual idea for the time. He wanted to make wristwatches. Back then, wristwatches were considered a novelty for women, almost like jewelry. Men preferred pocket watches, which were seen as more masculine and accurate. Hans's friends mocked his vision, saying that a watch small enough to be worn on the wrist would be too delicate and far too inaccurate. But Hans did not listen. In 1908, he registered a new brand name, Rolex. The name was short, memorable, and easy to pronounce in any language. He wanted it to sound luxurious, yet modern. There are many theories about where the name came from, but Hans himself claimed it was just a name that came to him, a name that sounded like a watch being wound. From there, he went on a mission to prove the critics wrong. He partnered with Swiss manufacturers to create movements small enough to fit inside wristwatches, but accurate enough to compete with pocket watches. In 1910, a Rolex wristwatch earned the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision, a title previously reserved for larger timepieces. 4 years later, a Rolex received a similar award from the Kew Observatory in England, an honor no wristwatch had ever received before. Then came one of the boldest moves in Rolex's early history. In 1926, Rolex launched the Oyster, the world's first truly waterproof wristwatch. The name Oyster symbolized the watch's ability to remain sealed and resistant under pressure. To prove it worked, Rolex gave an oyster to a young English swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze. She wore the watch as she swam across the English Channel. The watch survived the entire journey and still worked perfectly at the end. This brilliant mix of product innovation and publicity began to reshape the global perception of wristwatches. Hans understood that marketing was just as important as engineering. He made sure that Rolex watches were worn by adventurers, record breakers, and pioneers. When Malcolm Campbell set the land speed record in Utah in 1935, he wore a Rolex. When the first expedition to Mount Everest was launched, Rolex was on the wrists of the climbers. By the 1940s, Rolex was no longer just a watch company. It was becoming a symbol of excellence, prestige, and achievement. In 1945, Rolex released the Datejust to mark the company's 40th anniversary. It was the world's first automatic watch to include a date display on the dial. But that same year, Hans Wilsdorf suffered another devastating loss. His beloved wife Florence passed away after a long illness. Hans had now lost both of his parents and his wife. He had no children. Despite his wealth and global success, Hans was alone. With his personal life empty and his health declining, Hans began to think about the future of Rolex. He did not want the company he had built from nothing to fall into the wrong hands. So in 1946, he created the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a private trust, and transferred full ownership of Rolex to the foundation. To this day, Rolex remains owned by that foundation, with no shareholders and no public financial disclosures. This ownership structure has allowed Rolex to operate in a way that is highly secretive and nearly immune to outside influence. The foundation supports charitable causes, education, and watchmaking schools, though some critics have questioned just how much of Rolex's billions actually go to charity. What is certain is that Rolex is not publicly traded, and its internal operations are kept under tight control. Employees are made to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. Even photographs inside Rolex buildings are largely forbidden. As a result, very few people know how Rolex really works. Hans Wilsdorf died in 1960, but the company he created only grew stronger. However, Rolex faced one of its greatest threats in the 1970s during what is known as the quartz crisis. Battery-powered quartz watches had entered the market. They were more accurate, cheaper, and easier to mass-produce than mechanical watches. Many old Swiss watch companies went out of business, but Rolex survived by doubling down on its identity. It stopped trying to compete on price or mass production. Instead, Rolex leaned into craftsmanship, heritage, and exclusivity. The brand's mystique continued to grow. In 2017, a Rolex Daytona once owned by actor Paul Newman sold for over $17 million at auction, breaking records. Today, even the most basic Rolex models sell for thousands of dollars. Some waiting lists can stretch for years. And yet, many people wonder, why are Rolex watches so expensive? The common explanation is that Rolex watches are simply built to a very high standard. The company uses its own in-house foundry to create the metal alloys. The watches are made with obsessive care, and they are designed to last for generations. But this is only part of the answer. The deeper reason lies in Rolex's ability to combine engineering with prestige, scarcity with desire, and performance with storytelling. A Rolex is not just a tool for telling time, it is a symbol of status, taste, and achievement. From a lonely orphan in Germany to the halls of the world's most powerful boardrooms, the story of Hans Wilsdorf is a powerful reminder that adversity does not have to define you. Through focus, creativity, and perseverance, one man changed not only the watch industry, but the way the world measures success. And that is why Rolex is not just expensive, it is iconic.